Tonight, an exclusive interview with King Abdullah of Jordan. The king came to Washington at a crucial time. Jordan is part of the U.S.-led coalition against ISIS. It has also borne a heavy burden from the flow of Syrian refugees into Jordan. King Abdullah met Senate leaders and White House officials and the vice president. Today, he met with President Obama. We spoke yesterday at his hotel in Washington, and we began with the threat of ISIS. Here is that conversation.
Your Majesty, thank you very much for an opportunity to talk to you during this visit to the United States. Let me talk about ISIS and what you see as the threat today from ISIS.
Well, ISIS and their like. So what we have to understand that this is a global jihadist movement, and it's not just the threat that we're seeing today, although the priority for many of us is dealing with Syria and Iraq. We have to remember that also we need to look at the Sinai, we need to look at Libya, the other elephant in the room, Somalia, Mali, Nigeria. So we have to have sooner, I hope rather than later, a strategic, holistic approach to being able to deal with all these organizations that actually are the same, different names, but the same beliefs.
What would a holistic approach look like?
Well, it means that all of us reaching out to each other. We in Jordan are obviously dealing primarily at the moment with Syria and Iraq. But we, in partnership with some of the other countries, I just came from Egypt 2 or 3 days ago talking to President Sisi, the importance of reaching out to our African friends, 2 countries that are, I think, going to be the lead in dealing with these issues in Africa. Obviously, the President of Gabon dealing with Boko Haram on one side, with the Central African states, President of Kenya down in the south dealing with Shabab and moving up towards Somalia. So this is an issue that we really have to combine our strategies, and this is sort of one of the reasons why I'm here in Washington. To let's not. I know we have to concentrate on Syria and Iraq, but we really have to have a pan regional approach to this issue.
But with respect to Iraq and Syria first, the question arises about airstrikes, and are they sufficient to stop ISIS?
No, I mean, we knew the airstrikes are extremely important, and can you imagine what the situation would be without airstrikes? Airstrikes by themselves would not defeat ISIS. The issues now is how do you develop the ground play. In Iraq, it's slightly different, although we have to sort of combine Syria and Iraq together. You can't have solve one situation and think of solving the other. So we have to chew gum and walk at the same time on both these issues. With Iraq, it's slightly a different set of circumstances because we're working with the Iraqi government to be able to assist them against ISIS. Supporting the Kurds is vital, getting them the proper equipment so that they can also be able to deal with ISIS with efficiency. And most importantly is reaching the Sunni tribes in Western Anbar that are under tremendous threat of ISIS. A lot of the tribes are being executed by ISIS, and there's a time factor there that's extremely important. What you don't want to see is, if we delay too much, that the local population being massacred feel that they have no resort but to surrender and come under ISIS. There are some operational delays through no fault of anybody's because of capacity capability of the Iraqi armies to be able to alleviate a lot of these cities that are under ISIS control. So this is issues that we have to deal with, and some of the reasons why I'm here in Washington. We have to reach out to the Sunni tribes in Western Iraq sooner rather than later.
What's Jordan's role?
Well, we're part of the coalition. We have been working in Syria as part of the coalition. We've been talking to the Iraqis how we can assist them in Western Iraq. I think that's going to increase in the very near future. And then the role of Jordan elsewhere, because we're part of, I think, this regional international capability. So a very small country, but with many, I think, responsibilities throughout the region to combat this global threat.
There's some question of NATO training troops and some reports that they may be trained in Jordan.
Looking for, we're talking to the Iraqis. They have some interest of us doing some training for them. Prime Minister Abadi came to visit us about 6 weeks ago. Very good visit. We're opened all our doors to see what we can do to help the Iraqis. Obviously, looking at training a Free Syrian Army against ISIS is something that is ongoing in discussions. But how do we get to the tribes again inside of Syria, Eastern Syria in specific, that are fighting back against ISIS? Again, one of the problems is that there's a perception in Eastern Syria, in general, but also in Western Iraq, that the international community only really gets excited when minorities get jeopardized. So the Christians in the summer or the Kurds, but when it comes to the Sunnis, they're being ignored. So this is why the time factor, I think, is very important. We have to reach out to the tribes in Western Iraq and into Eastern Syria to make them feel that, people
when you say reach out, what do you mean?
Well, get equipment to them, get support to them. There are ways of doing that I've been talking about for several months. But by the end of the year, action has to be taken. There's not things that I'd like to discuss on this venue, but there's things that we're going to have to pull the trigger on, so to speak, I think in the next several weeks.
But does it include Jordanian troops?
I believe that at the end of the day, whether it's in Iraq or in Syria, it has to be done by the local populations themselves. But getting them supplies and support is another issue. So how do you physically get them support? There is airplay at the moment in strikes. Do you get supplies to them through air? Do you get them supplies through ground? And how do you protect and support that? Those are things that I think are going to be discussed. But I don't want anybody to think that any of us are talking about the concept of boots on the ground, foreign boots on the ground to solve the problem. At the end of the day, Syrians have to solve the Syrian problem and Iraqis have to support the Iraqi problem.
But is that sufficient in Syria?
Syria is not going to be a quick fix. Anybody who thinks it is doesn't know the situation. And again, what I think you have to understand, part of the complications with Syria is there's two issues there. There's actually technically two wars in a way, which complicates the discussion on Syria. There's the war of regime change in the West and the war against ISIS in the East. So again, using the American vernacular of chewing gum and walking at the same time, that's part of the problem.
And in the West, it's Assad is the enemy, and in the East, ISIS is the enemy.
To make it very simple, yes, yeah. So that's part of the complications when you're trying to look at solving the problem. And then also create a problem, which is, so the discussions we've had in Congress the past 2 days, different people have an idea of what they think is a priority. And so that adds to the complications.
What do you think is a priority?
Well, global jihadists is a problem.
That's the priority of overthrowing Assad.
In our view, that's the immediate threat. And
that's the American view as well.
Well, I think because of the mass executions that we're seeing, is how do we get straight onto the ground to save people? But again, it doesn't mean that Bashar is a very nice individual and the regime has done wonderful things. So there's still a lot of people out there that feel that, does this mean that the regime gets off scot-free? So that's part of the complications. But sooner or later, I personally believe that the only solution to Syria is a political solution.
I want to come to that. But at the same time, it is argued here, in fact, Secretary Hagel said to me, if we inflict damage on ISIS from the air or on the ground, it benefits Assad. That's the reality of the battleground. Yes,
but don't forget that I think it was their strategy, the Syrian regime, over the past year and a half, not to hit the extremist units. They were hitting the moderate units, allowing sort of the extremist groups to gain ground, to create atrocities so that they could win the PR battle.
You've been asked this many times, how serious a mistake will history record the failure to support several years ago the moderate forces in Syria before ISIS had the traction and the power it now has?
Well, the problem is, I think that from the northern border, a lot of the equipment was going from the very beginning to the more extremist units and not to the moderate forces. And I think this is why we're in this mess to begin with. I think if you look
Could you have prevented that in some way?
Not Jordan, but those...
No, not you specifically, but the United States and other countries who were interested in supporting the moderate forces at the time. Was it an impossible task to arm them and to give them
No, it was not an impossible task. It was that I think that maybe the not understanding the rules of the game of where who the units were on the ground and who was benefiting from getting the equipment and the weaponry, and which units were getting stronger as a benefit of the supply in the north. The south was a completely different story.
Yeah, but you know forces inside Syria. My assumption would be you understood that. And my question would be, was your voice listened to at the time when the question of supplying the moderate forces was on the table?
If you want a simple answer, no.
It was not listened to?
Well, it was listened to but not acted on with the energy that I had hoped.
And now we have a much more difficult task.
Correct.
When you look at Syria today, how do you, so for example, the Turks raised the question of Assad before they would even support Kobani under siege.
Well, I mean,
it seems like Assad is becoming, among some of the coalition partners, the primary issue rather than the secondary issue.
Thus the complications of Syria.
Which is what I want you to speak to.
Yeah, so look, at the end of the day, there has to be a political solution, and the way that I think a lot of us are trying to get to is how do you get the moderate opposition, and what does a moderate opposition mean, to the table with the regime and finding a political solution. Because the way I've been seeing it for the past 2 years, the more one side supports, let's say, the opposition, others will support the regime. And the more that continues, then basically Syria becomes a completely unstable state, and it's only the extremists that benefit from complete chaos. So if we're going to sort of bring Syria back into the light, the only way we can do that is to find a political solution. Now, the problem in the middle of that at the moment is Bashar and Bashar's future. So how do we get around to doing that? In my view, I think the Russians play a very important role, because the Russians, at the end of the day, help play the guarantor for the future and the safety of the Alawites, which are a major entity of the Syria dynamics. And I think if we do pursue a political track, it's where the Russians come into this that can help us achieve a political solution.
Which begs the question, are the Russians prepared to do that on behalf of their relationship with Syria?
Well, in my view, you've got now this phenomena that's just created a problem for all of us in the international community, and that's the issue of foreign fighters. So you have now foreign fighters coming from all over the world, coming to fight alongside ISIS in Syria, and now today inside of Iraq. If you look at from the Russian point of view, Chechen extremist fighters are coming in to fight in Syria and Iraq that are going to be problematic, because eventually they go back to the Caucasus and create problems. Not only that, all the other jihadists that are looking for the next place to fight will also go back to the Caucasus. So they have as much of a problem, I believe, if not slightly more because of the numbers involved, than, let's say, other European countries, France, Germany, Italy, or anywhere else. So I think we're all in the same boat. I mean, you'd probably be surprised that we're picking up Chinese from Western China in Syria and in Iraq, and actually not too far away from our borders. So this has really become a global problem.
And how do you deal with that global problem?
Well, there is, on the other side is, I personally believe that we as Arab and Muslim countries, as I said to our parliament on the opening of parliament 2 months ago, this is a Muslim problem. We need to take ownership of this. We need to stand up and say what is right and what is wrong. This is no reflection of our religion. This is evil. And all of us have got to make that decision. We have to stand up and say, this is the line that is drawn in the sand, and those that believe in right should stand on this side, and those that don't have to make a decision and stand on the other. It's clearly a fight between good and evil. I think it's a generational fight. As I said to President Putin, I think this is a third world war by other means. I think.
Wait, let me just stop. you're saying this is a third world war by other means, and that's what you said to Putin. That's what you'll say to the President of the United States?
What I believe, I think I've already said to the President, and I've said to other leaders. This is a generational fight, and I hope that on a generational fight, so that people misunderstand me, I hope the short-term part of it is going to be the military. The medium term is a security aspect of it, but the long term is going to be the ideological one. And so what I'm saying is, we as Muslims have got to, look ourselves in the mirror and realize that we have this problem, make this very difficult call, and then all of us come together and clearly sort of say that these people are renegades. These people have nothing to do with Islam. I mean, we have this argument at the moment that they're saying there's extremist Muslims and moderate Muslims, and I don't believe that. I'm a Muslim. Why are you calling me a moderate Muslim? I'm a Muslim. I don't know what these people are.
You don't know what Baghdadi is.
These people that feel that our religion condones the execution and crucifixion of people, the beheading and the raping of women, that has nothing to do with our religion or other religions. So there's a lot of leaders around the Arab and Muslim world that have had enough, that want to come out in a voice and say, look, enough is enough.
But why isn't that an easy call for Muslim leaders? Why isn't that an easy call to say, this doesn't represent the religion?
You're seeing that more and more, and you will see more of that.
What's an example of that? You've seen it from someone other than you.
Just give us some time. There are discussions between a lot of us that are coming together to say that we have to make a stand. And as I said, because of the total globality of this issue, that we all have to coordinate. And as I said, because we're not dealing with the issue just in Iraq and
it's Yemen, it's
all over.
All over the world. But you have to deal with the immediacy of it in terms of Iraq and Syria.
Yes, and
it's
almost
serious, and they have more revenue, and they have more use of social media, and they have more weapons.
But almost instantaneously, you've got to look at Libya. So that's the other elephant in the room.
Speak to the risk in Libya, because there's not been much focus on it, even though we
surprisingly that everybody ignores Libya, which is also probably just as complicated and just as desperate. So does it take major atrocities there for the international arena to focus attention? So I think as we're getting the strategy and the tactics in place of Syria and Iraq, then people will start to focus on Libya. But by, I hope, the end of this year, beginning of next year, countries that will be coming together to start talking about Libya. Closer of a problem to the Europeans than it is to the United States, especially to those that are on the northern Mediterranean. So you see the Italians, the French, to an extent the Spanish taking the lead on that. But something that we have to deal with, because it also affects Central Africa and the rest of Africa.
Are you meeting some opposition as you try to make this case from people?
Not from the leaders that I've been talking to, not at all.
They're on board.
But how do we all come together and just get our script?
What's your roadmap?
I'd like to keep the roadmap to us at this stage.
But some suggest that some members of the coalition say, yes, ISIS is a huge problem, and yes, we have to do something about it, but there are also Sunnis like we are, and our opposition for dominance in the region is with Iran. You've heard that.
Well, again, you're going to have always regional
versus Sunni.
Well, I don't believe in a Shia versus a Sunni conflict. We're all one people, and that doesn't help. I think it goes deeper or slightly different than that. But if we look at this major international phenomenon, there's a common ground that brings us all together. And I'm hoping that that's where a lot of the leaders are thinking at this stage.
There was a leader in the Middle East who once raised the specter of the Shia crescent.
Yes, and I raised it from a political view, and again, from the jihadist global problem. Again, from the political point of view, we need to be able to tackle it. I don't believe that from a religious point of view there's any obstacles between us. And actually, it was last summer, or the summer before last, where some irresponsible members on both sides of the divide, clerics, tried to create a clash inside of Islam between Shia and Sunnis. And we had a conference where we brought Sunni and Shia leaders from all over the world to come and say, look, whatever's happening in Syria and Lebanon at that point, it's got nothing to do with interreligious strife. And actually the most moving part was actually at the lunch that we held on the second day, where two imams stood up, or two sheikhs stood up, Iraqis, one Shia, one Sunni, that said, look, he's a Shia, I'm a Sunni, we're both brothers. And whatever is happening in Syria or might happen in Iraq,
and those people don't represent either of us.
Yes, has got nothing to do with religion.
So therefore, tell me how you see the relationship on the ground between Iran, who considers ISIS an enemy, the United States, who considers ISIS an enemy, Jordan, who considers ISIS an enemy, Saudi Arabia, who now considers ISIS
the Gulf countries who consider ISIS an enemy. So it'd be interesting, as you mentioned, the Iranian airstrikes that you had just said earlier on in the interview. It'd be interesting to see how that plays out. But obviously,
so how might it play out? What would you see people saying to you privately?
I have to get back and sort of see what they have to say. Obviously, like all regions, there's always going to be tensions and conflicts because of countries, border disputes. You're sort of implying religious problems. It's more historical problems. So I think that if there are tensions, they're based more on historical issues than they are on religious ones.
So the question of dominance in the region is more historical than it is religious?
Power plays that you find all over the world between big states and smaller states that have been there historically for many, many centuries.
But can you imagine Iran being part of a political solution in Syria? Because they have influence also with Assad. But they also need Assad because of the Syrian territory helps them.
I think their priority is Hezbollah more than it is Bashar. But I think that the guarantor when it comes to negotiations is more the Russians and the Iranians.
And you sense the will is there on the part of the Russians?
I think the Russians. I think the Russians. Again, going back to the foreign fighters problem, need, as we do, to sort of start to unravel this phenomena. And Syria is a good place to start because of, Damascus or Syria is not that far away from the Caucasus. And this problem of instability that ISIS, Syria, Iraq is presenting actually does go back to affect the Caucasus quite easily. And don't forget, the foreign fighters are not just coming from Chechnya. I mean, we're picking those from Uzbekistan. We're seeing from other of the stands coming in there.
And why are they doing it? Why are they coming to learn warfare? Are they coming because they believe in the ISIS mission? Are they coming because?
Well, part of it is the media play that ISIS and their groups are doing are quite successful because they take cherry-picking bits of the Quran and saying that this is what the Quran stands for, which is completely and utterly untrue. And they've been very successful in new media in reaching out to youth all over the world, frustrated people, young people without jobs, and being able to create a recruit. The other part of it, don't forget, is they're offering very good salaries. I mean, part of the problem that we had with ISIS at the beginning, and part of the reasons why the airstrikes were, I think, so needed, is the oil industry alone inside of Syria, especially around Deir ez-Zor, was netting them about $1 billion a year. So the salary for a recruit joining ISIS is about $1,000 a month, which is the equivalent of a colonel's pay in our armed forces. So you had these different aspects of how recruiting was working. What we're doing to sort of fight back now is to try to explain to people that all these things that you're hearing as the manifestos of, for example, Baghdadi, have nothing to do with the Quran. But part of the problem of the major recruiting issue, and I know that, I'm sure in America this in certain sectors doesn't go down well, is that the core issue in the Middle East is still the Israeli-Palestinian one. And until we solve that, that is a major recruitment for extremist groups. Now,
you told me, for example, that when the war in Gaza was taking place, recruitment by ISIS went sky high.
Absolutely. So,
because they use it even though it's not connected.
All extremists, all these jihadist groups use the injustice of what's happening to the Palestinians in Jerusalem as a rallying call. Now, I know there'll be a lot of comments made after I say that that's not true. It no longer matters whether it's true or not. What is true is that that's what the jihadists use as a recruiting element. And actually, since the airstrikes have happened, I think the amount of recruiters that have crossed the border into ISIS have gone up to about 3,000. So when you saw young women and children and the high death count inside of Gaza, we saw an immense amount of recruiting of ISIS into young people into ISIS.
When you look at the forces on one side, the United States, the coalition partners, you, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, you look at the goals of Iran. Why is this a tough fight? ISIS has money, clearly. It's able to recruit, clearly. But this is overwhelming force that's possible. Or why am I naive?
No, well, again, you've got to look at the complexities of what allowed them such a success right at the beginning. They were limited inside of Syria. The Syrian regime was on purposely not targeting them. They were targeting all the moderate units. So they were allowed to grow and establish themselves.
And they did that purposely obviously, because they wanted to see ISIS grow.
They wanted to see, well, it was other groups, and out of that came ISIS. So that they could win the PR game, to get the swing vote behind them, to show that, you know, there's people a lot worse than us. And they were very successful in doing that. When they entered Iraq in July, the uprising that happened in western Iraq was not because the Sunni tribes had any affinity for ISIS. It was the frustration with Baghdad for many, many years, because there was no, the Sunnis felt there was no political inclusion into the future of Iraq. Something that we had discussed with, not us just as Jordanians, but the Americans, with Baghdad for many, many years. And it was that frustration that exploded with the entrance of ISIS into Iraq in July. With President Abbadi now, Prime Minister Abbadi now is the new Prime Minister, he has reached out to the Sunnis, and I think the atmospherics are better. But again, there's a time factor. If he doesn't deliver some of these promises, then to the Sunni tribes that they are part of Iraq, that there is a future, that could backlash. And so, I mean, I sort of trying to explain to an American audience, we have Kurdistan, in a way we have Shiistan, but we actually have never had a Sunnistan. So unless we solve that part of the puzzle of Iraq, then the Sunnis are always going to feel isolated and to an extent betrayed.
Yeah, but Sunnis are the best people to explain that to them. I mean, you've got to promise them that the Shia prime minister is going to reach out and wants to have a relationship, but the people are best able to do that because of history, I assume, is fellow Sunnis.
To an extent, but again, I think there are a lot of Iraqis, whether they're Kurd, Shia, or Sunni, that believe in a united Iraq. And you've got to give those people the benefit of the doubt. But there are other elements of play inside of Iraq. You mentioned Iran. I mean, Iran, I don't think, would like to see a strong, vibrant Iraq for obvious reasons. So there is always internal play and pressures on Iraqi government to make sure that, you know, the Sunnis don't get sort of the things that they want in the way that they want. So that's an uphill struggle. But going back to ISIS, you know, I think that the Prime Minister Abbadi is committed. He has bureaucracy that he has to fight through, and we're all giving him the benefit of the doubt, and I hope that he does deliver. But again, the clock is ticking.
I want to move beyond that, but just there's no question in your mind that this battle against extremism can be won. And the definition of won is what? Well,
first of all, we all have to make a decision of what side of this we're on. So nations in the Arab and Islamic world have to stand up and say, you know, we're against this, and explain to our people there's a right and a wrong of this, and people have to make a decision. There's no longer can we allow complacency. 9/11 was an attack on the United States by an extremist group to try and create a clash of civilizations. They wanted the West to fight Islam. and we knew that was their target. They're actually after us. This is our war. This is a war inside of Islam. So we have to own up to it. We have to take the lead, and we have to start fighting back. And all of us have to make that decision and stand up to the plate and take our responsibilities.
And if you do that, extremism can be what? Manageable?
Well, I think
Eradicated?
I don't want to get into the details because a lot of us are talking to each other about how to deal with this. But what happens is, I think when you clearly define what it is to be a Muslim and what these people are, I think it defines the argument much easier inside of Islam of how to deal with this issue. Because I think a lot of people that are actually thinking that, oh, ISIS is something noble to be part of.
Especially the young.
Especially the young that are being lied to. Will have the right arguments to be able, the proper arguments, I think, have not honestly been properly defined and will be defined, I think, in the very near future.
You've referred to this many times in this conversation. This seems to be a significant moment, and the dialogue is important and crucial to come together to figure out how you're going to combat this.
Yes.
And it's both ideological, it's both education, it's both stopping the flow of money and a whole range of other
And it
things.
takes courage. At the end of the day, we have to be courageous to stand up and face this head on.
And what's the risk to that, being courageous?
What's the risk if we don't do it? I mean, for all of us, not just Muslims, but Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, everybody else.
Which raises the question, many friends of yours who worry about Jordan and you, they worried about you at the time because of what was happening in the Arab Spring, and you were the first to say you believed in the Arab Spring and you represented the Arab Spring, and you had listed a series of reforms that you thought were important for your government and for your people. What does the King of Jordan fear within his own country and the threat to him and his country?
I don't fear much. I have the confidence in my people. I have confidence in God. I think the question you want to probably ask is what keeps me up at night.
Yes. Thank you.
If you're looking from the challenges of what's going on in the region, we had this issue of fighting ISIS. We were part of an air coalition. Just little anecdote. My brother was commander of the Air Force several years ago, and when I was in New York and the coalition was formed, both him and the chief of staff went out to the air base and where we had collected all our pilots, all our F-16 pilots, and I said, just check. We ask for volunteers, and the chief of staff and my brother stepped forward and said to all the pilots, listen, for strikes against ISIS, we're only looking for volunteers. So anybody who wants to volunteer, please step forward. Every single pilot raised his hand and stepped forward. And that's just a reflection of the Jordanian Armed Forces, and it was the same discussion that I had when you went into Afghanistan. I went to our special forces and to our soldiers, and I said, how do you believe of our commitment to fighting the extremists in Afghanistan? And everybody was raring to go. So from that point of view, I think the morale is high. The Jordanians politically and militarily are in a very good place. But where we suffer from is poverty, unemployment. The economy is struggling, mainly because of the large number of refugees and the energy difficulties. So what keeps me up at night is the economy, poverty and unemployment, and our people suffering because of the burden of refugees.
Of the commitment to the refugees.
So people are suffering.
You saw the president of Egypt recently, Abdel Sisi. He felt compelled to take strong action against the Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood is a factor in Jordan? Do you feel compelled to take action against them?
Well, no, we haven't. I mean, they're an official organization. We had invited them to be part of the process at the beginning of Arab Spring. They were the first political organization that I actually talked to at the start of Arab Spring. They made their demands very well known. They wanted to change the constitution. They wanted to change They wanted a higher constitutional court. They had a list of things, all of which we have done, by the way. They wanted a national dialogue committee so that they could talk about reform. That was set up. They were asked to be part of the national dialogue, and then they refused to, because at that point, don't forget, Arab Springs was started by young men and women that wanted change. It was then hijacked by the Muslim Brotherhood, which was an organized political society. So they're the ones that took over from the youth that wanted change. And at that point, in Egypt, if you remember, the youth were replaced by the organized Muslim Brotherhood. And a decision was made, unfortunately, by them that staying in the street was a better way of going because they thought Jordan was going to fall. Jordan, if you remember our history, we've been through many, many crises over many, many decades. It's not by accident that we're still here and we're still strong. And that's, I think, a reflection of our people. If it's not by accident, it's because of what that you're still here? I think because of our people and because of the relationship that the country has with its leadership, and because we're all a united family. So we've been written off for I don't know how many decades. I think my father has been presented, His late Majesty, with the same set of questions that you just made. And so I think we're unified, we're strong.
Do you approve of what Sisi is doing in Egypt?
Listen, any person who is in that position with the challenges that he or she would have, I would commend them. The set of challenges that he has to do to really help his country are unbelievable. And the main thing that he's trying to do is bring back stability to Egypt. We need Egypt. Egypt is the linchpin of the Middle East. Not only
linchpin of the Middle East.
Yeah, it is. You know, they say ad-Dunya. They're the center of the Middle East for many, many reasons, historically, culturally, religiously. And we all need Egypt. And I believe that he is bringing strength to his country, he's bringing stability to his country. The economy is a major challenge for him, but at the same time he has to deal with instability in Sinai, which we're all trying to help him on. He is on one of the largest borders of Libya, which is, like I said, I mean, if we're all talking about our concerns on Syria and Iraq, imagine what his problems are facing Libya and what he has to deal with. So all of us have to stand by the Egyptians and by him because he's got so much on his plate. And, you know, when I worry about my challenges and I think what he has to go through, I mean.
I want to turn to Israeli-Palestinian issues, but before that, the refugee question. You have 1.5 million refugees.
We have 1.5 million refugees, over 20% of our population in the past year and a half. Almost 90% are outside of refugee camps. So only a very small portion in the refugee camps. The rest are all across the country. It's affected our schooling system, our healthcare. Our school systems have now regressed to going back to double shifts to be able to take up.
What's the economic measurement of this, what that has caused?
Well, I mean, your country has been so gracious and so magnanimous in helping us out with its aid program. And so please, I mean, my appreciation to the United States. I wish the rest of the international community could be as helpful. But with this year's budget, the donor aid only covers something like 29%. So we still have a shortfall of $1.9 billion just to cover the refugees out of our budget of $16 billion.
This is a responsibility you didn't ask for. So who should step forward? Because it is part of the reality that is happening. You have refugees. I mean, should the United Nations be stepping forward?
Well, the United Nations, because of lack of budget, have now also downgraded the ability of food supplies that they could give. So that's another burden that we have to deal with.
Is there a security element to this, beyond economic and humanitarian, in that some of these people may very well have come because they want to be part of some jihadist
No, there's always that threat. I mean, part of the problem is vetting the amount of refugees to come into the country, because not all those people coming across the border are technically refugees. There's some bad apples in that, and that's one of the daily concerns that we have. We've been, fortunate so far in making sure that, we've vetted as many people that have come across the border, but that's not to say that we've missed a few. So that's always going to be a concern.
Turning to Israeli-Palestinian issues, Secretary Kerry launched an effort and believed that it was possible that he could bring some kind of agreement between Palestinians and Israelis. It is said that you were right there in the middle of that you were there both advising, encouraging, a central part of it. Why did it fail?
Well, it hasn't failed yet. It's still an ongoing issue. The door is still open. And I think, if you remember, there was a trilateral meeting between Prime Minister Netanyahu, myself, and Secretary Kerry about 10 days ago, which was a very successful meeting. President Sisi called in, and we had about an hour conversation between the four of us on how to move things forward.
No, this was Secretary Kerry, you,
President Sisi, and Netanyahu.
Okay, Prime Minister of Israel.
Yes, and on how to move forward, and the necessity to move the Israeli-Palestinian issue forward, especially when all of us are dealing now with a much bigger problem, which is this international fight against international jihadists. So the world has moved on, but if we don't unravel and solve this problem between the Israelis and Palestinians, we're really going to be fighting this problem with one arm tied behind our back. So how critical it is for the Israelis and Palestinians to be able to move forward. Secretary Kerry has some ideas. There are things that were discussed between...
Well, what progress did it make? I mean, clearly Secretary Kerry was very, very passionate about trying to keep quiet what the deal was, because he believed if it was given, people would start picking at it. What was the essence of the deal?
I can't. Obviously, we were part of the process, because when it comes to final status issues, just about every single final status issue has something to do with Jordan, whether it's the border, whether it's Jerusalem, whether it's refugees. So this is why we were actually in a fortunate position of being able to help both sides overcome a lot of the obstacles. And as a result, for the first time, I think in the dialogue of the peace process, for them to having to talk to the Jordanians meant how serious it was, and how serious the process was, and how close we got to what is actually a very strong final package. For several reasons, we didn't manage to take the final step.
What are the reasons?
Both sides had their concerns.
Trust.
Trust is part of it. But I think they're back to hopefully overcoming that at the beginning of the year. There are issues that are being talked about, so we're keeping our fingers crossed.
So there's still possibilities within the remaining term of the Obama administration?
And has to be, because what happens if there's not? And I think this is the critical factor that both sides have to understand. We're now moving on to something much bigger, which is the global fight, this generational fight. If this thing is still cooking and not resolved, how are we ever going to succeed on this larger problem? So why is it now that all these governments around the world are sort of either indirectly recognizing the state of Israel, the state of Palestine, or saying that in a year or two, if you don't solve the problem, we're going to recognize the state of Palestine? Because of the foreign fighter problem that all these countries are having around the world, they're beginning to realize that all roads do lead to Jerusalem. And that if the Israelis and Palestinians don't solve this problem, it does have an effect with extremism and how it affects the Muslim populations in their country. That at the end of the day, the core issue is still the Israeli-Palestinian problem and Jerusalem, even though certain people don't like a reference made to that. Whether it's true or not, that argument is still being used by the extremists, and countries around the world realize that they have to solve the problem for their benefit. So it's no longer politics because of Middle East. It now affects the national security of countries around the world.
So they have a large incentive now to push for
Yes, so in other words, Israelis and Palestinians, for our sake, says countries around the world, solve the problem because it's affecting us.
Their argument is made that in the end, Israelis didn't win the Gaza war because of the repercussions of it.
I think from that point of view, you're correct. And if you looked at all the media outlets, the international media outlets during the summer, especially if you looked at, maybe not America, but if you looked at most of the international outlets that you think would be covering Ukraine as the head story, especially in Europe, they were not covering Ukraine. All the headlines was Gaza. So the attention has shifted. The understanding and the concerns are the core issue today. And so that has to be an understanding by the two players that we've all moved on to something bigger. And if you don't get it, we're all going to pay the price for it.
So what does you know well and have many discussions, including the one you mentioned, with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Does he get it? Did he get it that in your judgment, all the things you have laid out here, that the world has changed, there's a bigger issue, there's a time demand, and these countries are saying, you got to solve this. Does he get it? Does he feel that in your judgment?
I can say that the conversation, the four-way conversation between President Sisi, myself, Secretary Kerry, and Prime Minister Netanyahu it went on, I mean, Sisi called it was an hour four-way conversation, and it was a really optimistic, sincere conversation, and one that left me with a lot of hope. And the way that everybody was talking about the problem made me feel that they wanted to move forward.
Okay, hope is not a precious commodity, and you don't see a lot of it these days. What was it that made it hopeful?
Understanding how it affects, and also what I think Israelis need to understand is how, if this continues to go on, because now we've all moved off to another bigger problem, how this continues then to affect the Israeli-Jordanian relationship, the Egyptian-Israeli relationship. Because if this thing continues to create a turmoil, it does create tremendous pressures on Jordan and Israel and Egypt. And so I think there was a tremendous understanding that we have to move the process forward. And I think everybody left that meeting feeling optimistic and I think geared up to take it to the next level.
Have you seen any change since then? Has it been
No. I think, the feedback we got from both the Egyptians and the Israelis and the Palestinians. I mean, you're going to have different maneuverings by different groups, and there are different things that come up, whether it's the new Israeli bill or different initiatives.
What do you
of
make
the
of the new Israeli bill, by the way?
It definitely complicates things after we've come out of that wonderful evening.
So you came out of the meeting hopeful, and then you have this vote.
That makes things more complicated, but again, I'm looking to beginning of the year, some of the things that were said at the dinner, Secretary Kerry coming back with the next phase of getting them together. So what I'll say is I'll give everybody the benefit of the doubt, keep my fingers crossed and see what happens.
You worry about a third intifada?
Oh no, if you don't do it, there'll be a fifth, sixth, or seventh. There'll be another war in Lebanon. I mean, you could predict it. There is a reason why our military field hospital is still in Gaza, and we've kept it there since War I. Because if you don't solve the problem, it's only a matter of time until there's another one.
Did you recall your ambassador to Israel?
We called him back for questioning, and that was after 2 years of going back and forth on difficulties and issues that we had in Jerusalem vis-a-vis Al-Aqsa compound, and not being able to get proper responses on how to deal with the issues. Make a long story short, during the Gaza war, I did speak to the Prime Minister saying, look, this is really, really serious. We've talked about this on several occasions. If it continues like this, I'm going to have to take action. Action, unfortunately, due to an incident, was taken. The Prime Minister called me the next day after we took that decision. But with all sincerity, he said, listen, we need to de-escalate the tension. we created a set of procedures to make sure that things moved in the right direction. And since then, by the way, we've had the best Fridays of any Fridays in the past 15, almost 20 years in Jerusalem. So there is a willingness and sincerity on all sides to move the process forward. There is calm on Fridays, and there is procedures being put into place. We hope that once the procedures are all finalized, then the ambassador will go back very soon.
Finally, what's the status of Jordanian-U.S. relations?
Could not be better. We work, as always, in harmony in dealing with all the challenges. And as you know, Jordan is not just dealing with problems of just Jordan. We're working beyond that.
From the time that you said, that you didn't feel like there was a resonance to the warnings you were given, do you feel like that the administration here has changed in its attitude about the relevancy and necessity of the United States to take a lead and to be deeply involved?
Yes, well, I mean, I have a very strong relationship with the president, and I had a long session with him in February of this year, where we sort of discussed a lot of the issues that we're now dealing with. I had a chance to spend a lot of time with him at the NATO summit, where we sort of identified how to move forward on the issues of, as it turned out, the air campaign. He sent me a lot of his representatives to deal on the ground. General Allen is actually in Jordan as we speak, if not yesterday. How do we work with the Iraqis?
You're calling him to action? No.
He's always been very responsive to everything I do. He actually, when he looks at the problems of Syria and Iraq, I'm always impressed with how he looks at the things from many angles. And then we sit down and figure out how to do that, how do we get other people involved into the mix, and how to move things forward.
No question, your judgment, he understands and is at one with you in terms of laying out the threat, the wider threat that now exists in the world.
Yeah.
You're satisfied with
no, absolutely. No,
he only understands that and is engaged by it.
Yes, absolutely. And anytime there's a problem, I mean, he's always kept the door open. So if there's ever a difficulty, lift up the phone, give me a call, and we'll deal with it right there. So I'm very, very comfortable with the relationship that we have, his vision on how to deal with the issues. And as a result, you're seeing that there is a process going into place. And I will hopefully see him tomorrow, bring him up to speed of some of the things that we're doing, throw some ideas back and forth, and take it to the next level.
Not easy to be king.
Well, probably more difficult to be president.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.